Okay, Ms. Cammick, may I continue?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now we're going to work into another presentation. This is the presentation I perform for you guys every year. It's the pre-budget workshop annual budget presentation. Basically, it's a fairly comprehensive financial analysis of where we are financially as an overall organization. We build in a lot of historical data into this presentation, most of which goes back to about 2014. So we try to keep a rolling 5-6 year data history. I do have some other information that goes back to 1998 that I can also reference. It's not part of the presentation, but I'll reference that as we start looking at some of the information like you were asking for, Mr. Davis, from a historical standpoint. So we do have some of that available to us as well. But here's the basic agenda for this presentation. I am going to try and move through it fairly quickly because there is a lot of information. And again, I'll be glad to sit down with you at any time and answer any questions and go through it. But it basically talks about our funds. You've got the general fund, enterprise funds, which is Rock Quarry, the focus fund, your capital projects funds, and you hear us talk about the special revenue funds as an IE, unincorporated emergency services district fund. But we're going to work through our cash flow projection and expenditure history. We'll talk about our personnel expenses, the number of personnel, our little cost to serve analysis. The cost to serve in here is broken down by function. We do have, when we get into the budget development process, we've got that broken all the way down to the departmental level. So you can see what it actually costs us, or costs the taxpayers to serve that department. Revenue histories, we'll look at our millage rate trends. We'll talk about our debt margin a little bit, like I had mentioned earlier, a more detailed breakdown of our fund balance. I'll do a balance sheet comparison, and then we'll talk about capital projects, and then, of course, our revenue projections for next fiscal year. We're a little farther along this year at this time with our revenue projections. I feel fairly comfortable that we're pretty close to locking those in even earlier this year. Last year at this time, I was just giving you a guesstimate on those projections, but due to a lot of hard work from the team I mentioned earlier, we've got some pretty solid revenue projection numbers for you, and then obviously we'll go through any questions that you may have. From a cash flow projection, this is something, as I mentioned, I do every organization I walk into. First thing I do is grab their financial statements and sit down and provide a cash flow projection. This is a pictorial representation of that. In your book, behind that graph, you'll see the actual information that I use and where I actually projected out by function the cash flows for the next 4 to 5 years. Just to kind of toot my own horn a little bit, I went back and looked at the current years and verified that with what I said 4 years ago of what our projections may be, and I was actually within about 3%. So these are pretty solid. These are pretty accurate numbers as you walk through it for anywhere to 5 to 6%, and it just gives you a good indication of where you're headed if you don't start making any changes to your budget practices. But you can see here that we see a little bit of a gap in our expenditures and our revenue projected over the years. So this is just a good forecasting tool that we can use to know we have to make some decisions going forward. But from a cash flow standpoint, that's kind of what it's looking like in a graph format. It's not, I don't think it's dangerous. I don't think it's bad. You'll have years where you're up and down, like you see earlier in the 9s and 11s and 13 time frame. You'll have years where you're up and down. I mean, it's going to happen. But you can see that we kind of recovered, and we started staying right on track and steady with our expenditure and revenue. So I think we've done a good job. Council's done a great job of monitoring that and keeping it locked in. We've seen some, increases in our revenue. Obviously, as we start seeing the market recover, we've seen some increases in our revenue. But we've also seen a decrease in the percentage of that revenue being property taxes. So we've seen an increase in our fees, as I mentioned to you earlier with that one graph I wasn't sure about. But you're seeing less dependent on property taxes, and then your budget's also going up. So that's always good. But again, the more important information is in the sheet behind that graph in your book, and that shows you the actual cash flow breakdown that I put together. And again, we finance updates it for us every year. Okay, some brief little expenditure history in your general fund. Fiscal year 13 through fiscal year 17, so it's the last 5 years. Obviously, the 17 numbers are the budget because we don't know the final actuals, but everything else is an actual number. So you can see in fiscal year 13, we had about a $42.8 million budget. Current fiscal year is 45.9. Now let me stop right there for just a second and point out that looks like we saw a $3 million increase in our budget, but if you recall, from 16 to 17, we added over $1.5
Sounds like it's on. You sure you didn't break it when you dropped it?
No, it said low battery and it turned off.
That's us.
Oh, that's on.
Every time you touch the,
Wow.
also hear it on the.
Wow.
Everything. Call Wayne in for backup.
That's one thing I don't carry with me. I don't do nails.
Okay, we're back at it. Sorry about that. It's like your smoke detector. It never goes, the battery never goes dead during the day. It's always at 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so as I was saying, it appears as though your general fund budget went up by $3 million, really almost $4 million, but if you recall, we saw an increase in almost $1.5 million in our other financing sources, and that is due to the $1.4 million we set aside in fund balance replenishment when we transferred the bond millage over this year. So I think that's important to note. Plus, we saw a significant increase in our public safety as well, obviously with the implementation of the new salary structure for the Sheriff's Department. So you can look through here and see most everybody stayed fairly steady from 2013 to 2017. Up and down depending on the expenses necessary for that year. But there's your breakdown from 13 to 17. And I put it into a graph format for you as well. Each function is identified by color. You can probably guess public safety is your green color, and then blue is your general government, which are the two dominant. If you recall, public safety was 41% and general government was 25%, if I remember correctly. But we showed it to you from 13 to 17. Over the trend. And as you can see, from 13 to 16, we stayed fairly steady, and then we saw a jump in 17, again, predominantly because of the increase in the public safety budget, but also we transferred the debt millage over, and we saw, $1.5 to $1.6 million increase in our budget because of that. And then we put 1.396 of it, I think it was, into fund balance replenishment. So that's kind of the graph representation. Now, to go back to some of the questions earlier, let's talk about personnel versus operations. I think it's always important to verify in your expenditures what is operations and what is personnel costs. So we've broken your personnel costs down into two, your salaries specifically as well as your benefit total. Because an organization can lose track of their benefits, and it can be a significant increase in their cost if it's not monitored. So we like to monitor not only our salaries, but the actual benefit costs as well. I'm extremely proud of what we've done over the last 3, 4, 5 years. We've held our benefits costs steady. About 4 years ago, we met with our benefits consultant, if you will, and I gave him a demand that I want to see over a certain time period a $4 million decrease in our actual personnel costs from a health insurance standpoint. We made some adjustments to the plan. We changed some of the network providers and the network, and we actually were able to successfully forecast that savings. So we've been able to hold our benefits total online, and we have not had to touch our $2.3 million worth of healthcare reserve fund balance that's in our fund balance. So you can see the breakdown here of our salaries. You can tell that we've given increases in salaries every year pretty much. And then a significant increase in fiscal year 17's budget with the addition of staff and the $1 million, close to $1 million, like $900,000 increase in the salary structure for the Sheriff's Department. So you saw a really significant increase there. Over the years, when we've given a 3% increase or a $1,200 increase to the staff, you can go ahead and guesstimate that that's going to be about $500,000 to $650,000 a year in increased personnel costs. So every 3% is about a $550,000 to $600,000 increase. $1,200 ended up being right around $500,000 to $550,000 increase in your total salary cost. So that's just kind of a good rule of thumb as you forecast out raises in the future. 3%, $600,000. Around that ballpark. So That's what you can see it doing to your budget from a personnel cost. And then you got on top of that, of course, any matching requirements in your FICA and Medicare and retirement and such. So you can see the salaries total. The operation expenditure, I'm also want to point out to you, we started at 16.7, and you can see we've really dropped those, tried to cut those operation expenses back to the tune of $3.5 million in that 1 year alone. And then we kind of creep back up, and then we stayed at that point. Now this increase right here is, again, there's $1.4 million worth of fund balance replenishment in that. So that's 15.6 if you take that into account. But anyhow, or right here, I'm sorry, 1.4 million. So that's 14.7 million. So not as big of an operational increase as you would think. But there's your total budget between operations and salaries. But again, I'm really pleased with the pattern of our operation expenses so that we can actually absorb the increases in the personnel costs. And that's what I try to tell my staff is, you know, let's get smart. Let's hold the line on our operations and make cuts where we can. Guess what? That frees up available money. If council wants to, you know, see to give them a raise, you've got the money available to do that. So let's not waste our money on operations. So we've done a good job. And again, I've got, you know, looking back, even since 1998, let's go back 17 years. Let's go back to 2000. The general government expenses in 2000 were $8.5 million. Again, 17 years ago. Right now, they're only 10.5. The year before, in fiscal year 16, they were 10.5. So we've only seen, even in 17 years, an increase of, what, $1.9 million in our general government. Now, public safety started in 2000 at $15.5 million. They're now at $16.7 million. So that's, again, over the last 17 years, there's been a focus on investing in public safety. And again, I want to make sure I reiterate, it's not just the sheriff, it's not all him. It's emergency services, community development, coroner, it's multiple departments involved in that category. So you've seen a significant investment from multiple councils in that time frame in public safety. Hang on just one second, Mr. Kane. So from a total standpoint, we've gone from a $27 million budget up to $42 million. So that's what, $15 million increase? Almost all of it has been predominantly, you know, 12 million have been in public safety. So everybody else has kind of held the line while we focused on investing in public safety. Yes, sir, Mr. Kane.
And no tax increases.
Well, actually, tax decreases. When we get to the millage, I'll address that. We've actually seen it lower since 2000.
Right. No millage increases.
It's actually been decreased by almost 2 mils.
Going to that fiscal year 2017 operations expenditure, the 16.12.
Mm-hmm.
What was the reason for that from the 14.23? And I don't want to get down in the weeds. That seems like it's probably an obvious change.
All right.
But
Now, what you see right there, there's a $1.4 million expenses right there. That's fund balance replenishment, okay? That's not operational expense. When you add it up, it looks like operations, but this came from,
we shifted our millage over.
right, so let's go to other financing sources. Oops, too far.
That's what I thought you were referring to, but.
Right here. Transfer from debt service.
Okay.
So while it looked like an increase of $1.5 to $2 million in our budget, really it wasn't. There was a transfer of $1.5 million from debt service that particular year. Now, if you look next year, when we look at our summary for next year's budget, when we get to that point, you'll see some shifting, right? So your other financing sources where you had $1.315 million in one-time money, Patillo, economic development, fund balance, and you had $1.489 million in transfer from debt service millage. So you had over $4 million really of one-time and transfer money. Now look at it, it's back down to the normal place of $828,000 for your typical uses, other financing uses. But 1.5 of that has been transferred up to here now because it's millage that's staying in the general fund. So your property tax revenue has increased by that equivalent amount. Actually, it's a little bit more. We recovered a little bit of increase in our taxes based on our projections. But so that 1.4 went from here, and you lost the 1.3 of one-time money. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome. So there's, like I said, almost $3 million right there looks like we lost, but we didn't. Okay. So again, a breakdown just of your personnel, salary, and benefits numbers. And then we look at some of the personnel expenses as a percentage. You've got your salaries total, again, for each year going down the top, your benefits total. But you also have your total personnel cost as a percent of your total budget. So what we did was, for fiscal year 17, we said, what percent of our total budget is personnel? And it's about 44.25%. So we gave you a percent trend to kind of look at how that's going. As you can see, in the last 5 years, we've increased from 40 to 44% of our total budget is personnel costs. Well, you're going to have that when you maintain a steady budget number, but you increase increase expenses by giving raises. So you're going to have that gap kind of widen. We started out at right about 60% of our total personnel costs if you include benefits and salaries. Now we're at about 63%. So you've kind of seen a shift now that we're becoming less dependent on operational costs and more dependent on personnel costs. So, and that's just a breakdown of the actual cost. This doesn't have any of the percentages in it, but we did work the percentage here. So you can see our budget's becoming more and more personnel expense oriented than operational oriented, while we've seen a steady budget and no tax increases. Okay, number of personnel. This is always important to monitor. Why? Because we just found out that the most expensive part of our operation and most important is people. So now let's look at how many people we actually have. We've heard a number of people talk lately about the increasing personnel costs. And I think there was one even said, Mr. Mulder is increasing the personnel like crazy. I can't remember. But let's take a look at where. In fiscal year 2008, we had 410 people that worked for the county. Now we've got 457. Yeah, that's a 47-person increase since 2008. 2008. 47 people we've added. Now let's do some quick math. Public safety again, we had 158. We now have 205. Anybody know what that number, if you do that math? 47. The rest of them, we've seen decreases and increases, not because we've seen increases or decreases, because we've shifted the resources into the areas that were most efficient. For example, procurement used to have 3 people. We've got 2 phenomenal people in that office. We don't need 3. Those 2 people can get the job done. We took one away and we gave it somewhere where we needed help without increasing cost to the budget. So IT had at one time, I think, 6. Now they've got 3. We've actually done away with 3 positions in that department. So anyhow, if you look at your general government, we've actually seen since 2008, where people think most of the waste is, we've actually seen a 5-person decrease in general government. Public safety, we've seen a 47-person increase. That was 15 firefighters, if you remember. Actually, it's probably a little more than that, because back then we didn't have all the command staff as well, so it's probably more like 16 or 17. In the sheriff department, we saw, was it 12 total we ended up, Sheriff? 12 increased in the detention center. We saw 2 in the lake enforcement officers. So we saw 1 in the grant. We saw 2 in the attorney. So yeah, we've seen an increase in our personnel in public safety, but they were all critical components to increasing the service level of our operations. So I just want to point that out to you. Yes, we've seen a 47-person increase in our personnel over the last, 9 years? But all of it was pretty much associated with public safety and not in other areas. Transportation, solid waste was at 43. They're now down to 36. Transportation was at 43. They're now down to 41. So we've seen the decrease in a number of the areas. And then again, just a chart or a graph showing you what that trend has been over time, kind of a line chart. So that's your personnel count. As part of that, in your book, behind that sheet, you'll see more detailed information of which departments. It's actually broken down by department. I know that slide was by function, but you'll see it broken down by department where our personnel has shifted and been added. Okay, this is the cost to serve analysis that I had mentioned to you. What this is we took the total budget by department, and we took the total tax revenue, and we took the total revenue generated by each department. For example, the airport. The airport generates a lot of revenue through fuel sales and rent and such. So what we did was we took each department's budget and netted out the revenue, the direct revenue that they generate. okay? So the airport generates, let's say the airport has $10 in expenses, but they generate $9 in revenue. That means they have a $1 cost impact to the county taxpayers, as an example. That's how we've set this up. So we took the total cost, and then we netted out the revenue to leave us a net cost, and then we took the non-property tax, non-departmental specific revenue. For example, aid to subdivisions, miscellaneous revenue, things that we get in that aren't directly impacted by one department, and we gave each department a proportional share of that revenue. So if you were 50% of the budget, we accounted for 50% of that non-departmental specific revenue to you. And then we gave it and spread it out over everybody. So what we found out was we wanted to see what the net cost to operate was when you reduce it by the revenue that's generated by that particular department. Then we figured out what mills we needed from taxes in order to support that particular operation. So you can see we've got a 73.9 mil millage value. Approximately 30 of it is public safety. So again, almost half of it is public safety. General government makes up the next largest share at 15.5 mils of revenue, mils of taxes is needed to support that particular operation. And we gave you the operational and personnel cost associated with each one of those function areas as well, the total number of employees assigned to that function area, and what your cost per employee is to that function area. And one of the things that surprised me is our judicial services, other than economic development, which is a little unfair because there's very few people in that office. But they ended up at $70,000 per employee, and I think Richard makes 3 times that. That's why it's skewed. I don't know. But the other one that surprised me was judicial services at $66,000 an employee. That seems a little strange, but that's where it stands, and we're going to monitor that. But so you can see here what our cost per employee is in each one of those departments. Now, when I say cost per employee, that's not salaries. That is salary, health insurance, and all contributions made for retirement, FICA, and the like. So that is total cost of having that employee work for us. So you can see here our total employee count, what the cost is. We actually break this report down by department for you when we go through the budget process. So when we actually get our budget calendar for this year, our budget book for this year, you'll see on the bottom of each department, finance is broken down for you, a cost to operate that specific department. So you can see the ones that are costing the taxpayers more proportionally than everybody else. So it's, we started doing that about 4 years ago, and it's actually a neat little thing to look at as you go through to see what each department's actually costing the taxpayers. You have some departments that are actually paying into taxes. Those departments that generate more money than they spend obviously pay into taxes and are a subsidy for everybody else. And you'll see that when we get to the department level. But that's your breakdown of function area. Your revenue history, we've broken that down for you again by function area. You have more specific information in your book. Each one of these slides, when we break it down for you, we've provided to you the more detailed information. So I think this one's in there. If not, you'll get it when we look through the budget coming up here in the next month or so. But again, total budget, and then we've broken it down by revenue. You can kind of see our intergovernmental revenue, not much has changed. Once the state reduced their aid to subdivisions, they left it at that amount. So our intergovernmental revenue has pretty much stayed lock and barrel in the same. Our licenses, permits, and fees has actually seen a little bit of an increase, like you saw in the previous chart. And then fines and forfeitures, we're seeing a decrease, but it's staying pretty much the same. It's a very small percentage. But you're catching the trends there. And then, like I said, here's that, as I spoke to you earlier, Mr. Kane, to answer your question, there's that $1.2 million in one-time fund balance usage from that particular fiscal year showing up right there again. And if you subtract that down, you're now at $44.8 million from a total tax standpoint. And then when you go up and look at your tax figures and your other financial sources, you've got $44.8 million increase. If you take that away, but if you take away the $1.5 million, it's 43.5. So you're more along the lines of where you were historically in your budget, and that's where that biggest change came from. Again, just another graph. I'm not very smart, so I like pictures. Millage rate trends, okay. We've got these numbers since 2007. In 2008, and this is where I told you we're actually less since that time frame, we were at 75.2 mils. Right now we're at 73.9 total mils, so we actually had a tax decrease during that same time frame that we were talking about. Now, out of fairness, if you go 1 year earlier, I can make all the numbers look as good as I want, okay? If you go 1 year earlier, it was 73, so it's actually been increased by 0.9. It just depends on which year you look at. It's fair to say that we've had a decrease since 8, but we also had an increase since 7. So let's be fair with our representation here. But it's pretty phenomenal, though, that 10 years ago, we've got the same millage rate. So our impact to the taxpayers in 73 is pretty much the same from a millage rate standpoint, 0.9 higher. But that's a 10-year period where costs have been going up, recession, market economy's driving. I mean, there's so many different factors, but we're still relatively the same. We saw a slight decrease over the years, and then right here we put in place one new road maintenance millage, 2.1. So that was the reason for that increase, was that 2.1 mil increase. And then you can see the adjustments we made last year when we shifted the millage from the debt service over to the general fund. That went down 2.8 and that went up 2.8. Okay, so you can see that's what had that impact on the total budget. Now, you can't look at that in a vacuum. You've got to pay attention to, because most people say, well, why has your budget gone up so much if your millage rate stayed the same? Well, that's directly driven by the other factor, and that's your, thank you, that is your assessed value. Okay, so as you can see, we've seen a lot of growth and development over the years, especially since 2004. Your total taxable value, meaning the value of your mill, this ought to look familiar to you. If you divide that by 1,000, that's basically the value of your mill. For every mill, you generate $342,000 in taxes, okay? So that's an easy way to look at it. Take this column, take 3 digits off of it, that's the value of your mill over the years. So basically, every mill in tax you charge generates that much money. So you can see the impact that growth has had on us over the years, our real property, our personal property, and then other is going to be manufacturing, utilities, and such, okay? This is your houses and land, this is your vehicles, and this is your utilities, private land, industrial land, and everything else. So there's your total taxable value over the years. You can see we ended up at about $546,000 in fiscal year 16. The reason why we had to amend the budget to add $500,000 worth of revenue is associated with those numbers right there. Remember, I did the budget amendment review. We had the $513,000 of increased revenue that we amended the budget for. That's because the value of our mill went up. So for every mill we charged, we got an additional $1,000, right? So 21,000 times 73 is, anybody know? Okay, I don't either, so let's move on. I'm not that fast. So anyhow, that's associated with the health of your community. You're seeing a very healthy increase in the value of your mill. You'll hear me say we had 1 year where we actually had a decline, and that was due to the reassessment coming out of the recession, and that's right here. In fiscal year 12, we had 517 and we went down to 515. So that was the 1 year over this history we've actually seen a decrease in the value of our mill, and then we started working our way back up again, and we're at 546. So there's two variables. There's millage and assessed value. Those two drive your tax revenue. If one goes up, it all goes up. If the other one goes up, it all goes up. But there's your history, so you can kind of follow where we've charged our taxes over the years. And again, the increase we had right there was the addition of the road maintenance mills. But everything else has pretty much stayed steady. This is to go back to your question earlier, Mr. Davis, your debt service millage. You see how it kind of goes up and down? That's because of the annual payments that you would have that particular year. We only needed 1.6 mils in fiscal year 10 because we apparently had some debt drop off after fiscal year 9, right? I can probably assert that just with confidence, we lost some debt payments that year. So now we only needed 1.6. And that was, part of the reason for the decrease. Then we issued the debt for the detention center. I guarantee you right there, jump right back up, right? So then we decided, let's try and hold it at 6 and 6 and 6, and then we transferred it back, so. Here's your debt margin. This is also very important to monitor. The state law limits the amount you can borrow without voter approval at 8% of your assessed value, which also makes this number very important. The higher this number goes, the more debt you can issue with an 8% without voter approval. So over the years, you can see how you read this. This is your assessed value of taxable property. This number should coordinate directly with that column on that number right there, or on that page right there. So this is our assessed value. You can see it's climbing and climbing and climbing. The 1 year it went down, and now we're at 546. Here is the legal debt limit. So we've calculated the 8%. So in 2009, the total amount we could borrow was 37.8 without a voter referendum. Now, because this number is climbing, this number is higher, because now 8% of that is actually 43.7 million. So now we can borrow total up to 43.7. Now, what I've done is I've got your net debt applicable to the limit, right? So what we've done, there's that year we went down, and there's the year we went up, right? So here is what we've got outstanding in our debt. All right, this is our outstanding principal. We got up to our highest point when we issued the debt for the detention center, and now it's worked back down, and you can see we're starting to pay some things off again. Netted out, this is what we can actually have left to borrow. So if we had an emergency and we needed to borrow $30 million, we could do it with 3 readings and ordinance right now. Not that I'm proposing or recommending, but that's what you have capable of doing. So you can see here, this is what you have the capability of borrowing right now without voter referendum. And then this is just the chart. Now how you read this top line, this is your limit, okay? So you can see this 44 million connects directly to this 44 million. This bottom one is how much outstanding debt you have. So that is this net debt applicable right here. And the middle one is the amount that you have that you can borrow, which is this bottom line right here. So you can see, since this is way down, this is up. But as we issued more debt, the amount that we could borrow comes down to match it. So it's actually directly coordinated, okay? So that's how you read that. So that's what you have available left in your debt margin. Your fund balance breakdown, how much more time I got?
20 minutes.
All right, 20 minutes. Let's rock and roll. All right, fund balance breakdown. So as of June 30th, 2016, we went through this as part of your fiscal year audit for 2016. This is the same information. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's not broken down as in detailed. If you remember my terms, unassigned and assigned and all that. This has actually got your capital projects, economic development, and other governmental funds too. But we've spent a lot of time on the previous presentation on that. It's all the same numbers, so I'll skip through that. Here's your balance sheet combined. Again, your cash. This is what the treasurer is always concerned about up here. Cash flow, having enough cash to pay the bills. So this is your cash, and you can see your advances to other funds as it's grown over the years for your focus fund, right? We've talked a lot about that lately. This is your cash, went up, and then we've started working back down, predominantly due to that. And then your investments have declined because we've had to take more money away to support the other functions than leave it in our investments. So that's why it's important to hurry up and start getting some of that back so we can start building that investment level back up. So again, this is just over the history comparison of your fund balance. And you can see assets held for economic development has stayed the same until we get rid of that property, right? We can't get rid of it because we still own that value of that asset until it's actually given. So. And then we continue with that onto the next page. Again, a more detailed breakdown, but we've actually shown it to you over the years so you can kind of see the trend. All right, so you can see solid waste reserve. We've actually spent a little bit out of it over the years, and now we're down to about $2 million. That $300,000 difference there went to it's not up here, is it? It's the $300,000 for the match for the CAT bus grant. And then your OPEB reserve, you can see here we really started investing in it in the 2015 timeframe. We're now at 1.2. Again, so it just gives you a better understanding over the years. Your total fund balance hasn't changed much. What changes is all the numbers in between up here as you shift things around and things occur. Your healthcare reserve, this is your cushion for any major expenses in your healthcare. Right now we're paying pretty much to the dollar with what we budget every year. But what happens if you have 5 significant illnesses in 1 year? That's what that cushion is for. Finance is actually right now analyzing whether that's a sufficient balance or not. Can we decrease it? Do we need that much there or not? So we're doing some analysis there. But anyhow, that's an over-the-year comparison of your balance sheet for your general fund. Economic Development Fund, this is part of your capital projects fund. Same thing, your revenues, expenses. We've been through that a little bit in your fiscal year 16 audit, but this also just gives you a breakdown of what we've done over the last 4 or 5 years. Bridges and culverts, same thing. The capital projects fund, this is the 13 fund, is that the number? 20 fund, 13. This is your 13 fund. At one time, this was $16 million. There was a lot of projects we had set money aside for. We've completed those over the years, and now you can see this is what's remaining. This is where we account for all of our capital projects. There's our capital lease money, that what was left at the end of 2016 that was still needing to be spent, and that's the dominant balance of the 1.3. So this should be more of a net zero account. As you work through your projects, you take your budgeted capital project money, you put it in here, you spend it, you zero it out. So this over time should actually work to be a net zero account. So after the fiscal year 17 but audit's going to show this number either zero or a lot less because we would have spent that money over the last year. Okay, revenue projections. This is the last thing we need to worry about. As I said earlier, we've spent a lot of time earlier in the process this year working on the budget for next year. We've actually generated what we think are very solid revenue projections for fiscal year 18. And I've also, when we get into the budget process, we've got the next 3 years worth of projections that I think are pretty solid based on the way we've actually managed the process this year. In the past, there was a lot of guesswork into revenue projections because you just don't know. You don't know what's going to happen with Duke. You don't know what's going to happen with some of the other properties. You don't know exactly how home growth and business reinvestment is going to occur. You don't know how many cars people are going to buy or if they're going to keep an old one that's going to depreciate. There's a lot of things you don't know what's going to happen. So it is a lot of scientific guesswork. This year what we did is we took true assessment numbers. Since property taxes makes up over 70% of our actual income, we went through to try and generate a process that's going to be more valid, more accurate. Took true assessment numbers. All right, so we broke our assessed value down into land and buildings, real estate, vehicles, BMW, fee in lieu of tax, merchant's inventory. We actually broke it down into utilities tax money, which is Blue Ridge, Duke, Fort Hill, and all the utility companies. And we really broke that thing down and assigned their assessed values, then looked at market conditions to say, okay, what are we seeing utilities doing over the next few years? What are we seeing vehicle sales do? What are we seeing property do? Assessor, you got reassessment coming up. What are we seeing right now? Community development, what does our building permit activity look like that's going to come on the books, due to improvements over the next few years? And forecasted out what our actual assessed value should be in each one of those categories, and then calculated that out based on millage rate. And I've got a spreadsheet, but I don't even understand it half the days. But anyhow, I got a spreadsheet where we put all that together. It's very, very long and complex, but it's there. And that's how we generated these numbers. So what we're proposing for fiscal year 2018 is a property tax revenue generation of $34.25 million. Our intergovernmental will see a slight increase. Licenses, permits, and fees, we're seeing some increased activity in community development. Due to new home neighborhoods, so we saw a slight increase there. Fines and forfeitures have seen a steady decline over the years. I don't know what's going on there. I don't know if our magistrates aren't issuing enough fine monies, if they're not collecting. I don't know if they're letting people off on personal recognizance, but I've actually gone through and broken it down by judge and looked at what the revenue and fee and fine activity is by judge to see where we're tracking, and I'm not going to use any names. But I've actually done that by judge. Don't ask me how I got the information. Charges for services. We're seeing a slight increase there. We saw some increase in our fees last year, but we're also seeing increased activity. Interest, obviously we're lower on cash, so our interest revenue is going to be a little low. Miscellaneous, and then other financing sources. And that's one of the biggest hits there because we've lost 1.3 in that one-time fund balance money, plus we moved the $1.5 million up to here. Okay? So that's your revenue projections. We're looking at a total budget of about $45 million next year and a difference of about $1.2 million. It's actually a slight increase in your budget in reality, even though that's negative, because we actually lost a $1.2 $3 million in one time, but we're only going down by 1.1. So there's about $300,000 increase elsewhere. Majority of that being right here. The increase in the millage revenue is about 1.5, but we are projecting about $236,000 worth of increased tax revenue that we did not have last year. That's because we see some of our industrial growth coming online starting next year, and we're actually tracking that as well. We've got all of our industrial growth projected out, thanks to the auditor's help on that as well, and DOR, Department of Revenue. We've actually been able to forecast out when our new industrial growth is going to hit our books, and we're forecasting that out. So there is your revenue projections for next year. Questions?
Madam Chair, if I can make a statement. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate all the hard work that you and, your staff has done on this. One thing I want to bring up is understand that we haven't had tax increases. We've had some, property assessments, which has increased the revenue on there. We've used a lot of one-time money over the last several years to balance the budget, and we chase our tail the next year to, balance it because we use that one-time money. I'm really glad to see a much better direction to what I feel like we're headed with, so we're not trying to balance with, $1 million here, $1 million there. So I think it'll be a lot more beneficial for future projects that we as a council choose to do. It's a lot more fiscal responsibility to our citizens as well, and I appreciate that direction that you're showing us as well. Thank you.
Yeah, to follow up with you on that, starting back in, let's call it 2000 and let's say 7, there was a $1.1 million decrease in fund balance, and then the next year is a $500,000 increase. But then we saw a significant $5 million increase in 2009, and then we used another $1.4 million slight increase, used another $500,000, used $2.8 million in fiscal year 13, used $700,000 in 2015, but in 16 you saw we as I showed you earlier, we actually had an increase to our fund balance in 16 for the general fund. So you can go back and track it through, and there has been a lot of fund balance usage even last year, or this year, $1.3 million of fund balance usage. Now, it wasn't the general fund, it was transferred from other funds, but yes, there has been a dependency, but I think we're seeing that need kind of dwindle off.
And using it for projects is exactly what it's supposed to be for, but when you're increasing your operating costs and using that to balance, it's just going to continue until you find a way to fund that operating cost, and I do appreciate that direction.
Yes, sir. I know it's a lot, so if there's any questions that are generated after this, great. We'll sit down and go over it, and we'll do even more of this as we get into the budget process here in the next few weeks. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Where are we? I'm sorry? Okay. All right, so it's almost time for Ms. Hart. Okay. Sure. Yes.